I'm Greg Hunter, and this is the weekly news wrap-up for Friday, 11/11/11. My big story this week, tensions between Iran and Israel. They're heating up. And they're heating up because of new revelations about Iran's nuclear weapons program. The IAEA says they are on the threshold of developing a nuclear weapon. Now, there have been reports about secret plans by Israel to attack Iran's nuclear facilities, but they're not so secret now, of course, and other reports that Israel could possibly attack Iran by the end of the year. Both countries have been upping their missile technology and upping their military. These are two countries that appear to be headed for war. I mean, Iran on the other side says, hey, listen, if we're attacked, we're not going to just counterattack Israel. We're going to also attack Europe and also the U.S. Another Iranian official said that if Iran is attacked, that they will counterattack and they will have a, quote, street fight, end quote, in the streets of Tel Aviv. This is a bad thing. If war breaks out, if Iran is attacked by Israel, it will plunge the world economy into a certain deep depression. Oil prices per barrel would skyrocket to $200, $300, $400 a barrel, and supplies could get cut, and probably will. This is a mess. Keep an eye on it. Next up, the European sovereign debt crisis. It really ought to be called a European bank solvency crisis. Yes, the banks there, I think, are insolvent. They're allowed to hold these sovereign debts on their books at par value because they changed the laws over there, kind of like the U.S. They've got a huge problem with Greece and Italy and Spain and Portugal and Ireland, and now the latest, Italy. They're changing leaders over there. Berlusconi out. Greece has already kicked Papandreou out. But it's not the leaders. It's the tremendous debt. It's unbelievable. Ben Bernanke gave a town hall meeting. He was lamenting the fact that if there's one of these big sovereign countries go under, that the U.S. and the world would be affected because credit markets would seize up. Big worry about the Fed. He gave a town hall meeting where he said that. He couldn't be more right. So listen, the risks with this European sovereign debt crisis are huge and they are real. And the problem with it is that they just don't have enough money. They have a bailout fund over there. They don't have any money in the bailout fund. They're going to Russia and the U.S. and the IMF and the Chinese to try to put money in this fund because they supposedly can't just print money. Another idea that came out of the G20 that is to, hey, maybe we can get Germany to put their gold reserves up. They're the world's number 2 holder of gold, 3,400 metric tons of gold and change. Of course, Germany said no on that. The debt of Italy, and I always include Spain and Italy together because as one goes, the other will go. 3.4 trillion in sovereign debt. The leverage on that is astronomical. We found out MF Global, it was playing with sovereign debt, had 40-to-1 leverage. I bet a lot of the other banks have that and maybe more. Now they're talking about, a 2-speed system, that there'll be 2 Eurozones. Well, listen, either you're in or you're out. I think that's crazy and not even doable. And I think it shows that they are desperate and they are grasping at straws. Well, one thing this crisis did reveal with this idea that they could collateralize this loan with gold, gold is front and center, a store of value. If these sovereign bonds were a store of value, they could back the fund with these sovereign bonds that are sour. Well, evidently they're not such a good collateral or such a good asset if they're sour. The banks, of course, are behind this because they recklessly loaned out money, and now they want to get countries like Italy and Greece and everyone else to basically strap on a plow and pull it for the next generation or two to make sure they pay off their bad debts. This is terrible. I think ultimately people will revolt, and I think we're headed for a crash, and I'm not the only one that says that. Many people think we're headed for a crash. The economy expert and writer of the best-selling book, The Black Swan, Nassim Taleb, he's at NYU now. He thinks what's going on today is worse. The situation is worse than in 2008, and I couldn't agree with him more. I think we're headed for some sort of crash. The only question is when and how big. Only 2 questions, I should say. Next up, the debate on this side of the pond, and really they're debating the only thing that really is worth debating at the moment, and that is the economy. And it was on CNBC. And listen, I watched this debate, and I wanted to see, who said what. And one of the things I noticed is that a lot of these guys, which I never have really heard them before, talk about how they're against the bank bailouts. Well, of course, they probably made some polls, and that's a hot button issue with the voters, and it's a good thing to say. Of course, they don't really define how they're going to stop bailing out the banks. And Ron Paul, who's been on this bandwagon for a while, he's totally against and always been against bank bailouts, and he defined it. Boy, he was unchallenged. He talked about how we shouldn't be supporting the housing market and suppressing interest rates, killing the dollar. He's talked about how we shouldn't be bailing out the banks through Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Not a word. I mean, one bank, Bank of America, had either forgiven or taken off its books $200 billion, Bank of America. And in this quarter, it was released that Fannie Mae is asking the government for another $7.8 billion for losses this quarter and to pay dividends back to the government that they're required to pay because they were bailed out in 2008. Are you getting that? They're borrowing money from the government to pay the government back? This is unbelievable. Only in America. Well, speaking of the housing crisis, more bad news about that. In the U.S., 10 million families, it was reported this week, are headed for foreclosure. Half of all the mortgage, another story by CNBC, half of all the mortgages are underwater, technically speaking. And this is with the government suppressing interest rates to hold interest rates down to, so you can get a 4%, around a 4% 30-year note. And the government is providing all the mortgage lending, at least 90% of it at some government agency. And we have 10 million families headed for foreclosure, and half the people out there with a mortgage are underwater. It's unbelievable. We're in a recovery. I wish they'd stop saying that. There's no recovery. And finally, a new report out by John Williams at shadowstats.com. You know, the annual deficits, have been topping $1 trillion in the last few years, and projections are that it'll be $1.3 trillion or $1.4 trillion, the annual deficit, right? Well, according to a new report by John Williams, he is estimating that the annual deficit isn't going to come in at $1.3 trillion or $4 or $5. It's going to come in between $5 and $7 trillion. And listen, John Williams is a Ivy League trained economist, and he's using, GAAP, generally accepted accounting principles. He says it's going to be between $5 and $7 trillion. Boy, that'll put the spotlight right back on the United States and take the spotlight off the European debt crisis, won't it? It's going to be a rough ride, folks. Thank you for supporting USA Watchdog. I'm Greg Hunter. That's the way I see it.